Sometimes we don't realize how far we've fallen until we're standing in the wreckage of what we've destroyed. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what truly matters. Greg Lathrop built his life on getting attention online. He traveled the world making videos that shocked people and got millions of views. He thought he was untouchable, but in a small Spanish village, Greg made one video that changed everything. He spray-painted a Virgin Mary statue for his online audience. What happened next wasn't just about losing followers or getting bad comments. His passport was taken. He couldn't leave. The whole town turned against him. Suddenly, this man who lived for attention found himself completely alone in a place where nobody wanted him. Can someone who spent years mocking what others hold sacred ever find his way back to respect and forgiveness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, Greg Lathrop had been nobody special. A college dropout working at a big-box electronics store in Phoenix, watching his high school classmates get married and buy houses while he lived in a studio apartment that smelled like microwave dinners and broken dreams. Then came the video that changed everything, a spontaneous decision to climb the fence at the Grand Canyon and dangle his feet over the edge while eating a gas station hot dog. He'd filmed it on his phone as a joke for his 12 followers, mostly college friends who barely watched his content. But something about that reckless moment, that casual dismissal of danger, struck a nerve with viewers hungry for authentic rebellion. The video exploded overnight. 1 million views became 5 million, then 10. Comments flooded in from people living vicariously through his fearless stupidity. Within a week, his follower count had jumped from 12 to 50,000. Within a month, brands were reaching out. Greg discovered he had a talent for finding the line between boldly entertaining and genuinely dangerous, and then stepping right over it. His content evolved from simple stunts to elaborate productions that pushed boundaries in ways that made audiences gasp and share compulsively. He climbed restricted monuments at midnight. He snuck into abandoned buildings and filmed himself spending the night in supposedly haunted locations. He crashed exclusive parties and filmed the wealthy attendees' reactions to his presence. His signature move was laughing, that carefree, infectious laugh that made viewers feel like they were part of his inner circle of mischief. The money followed quickly: brand sponsorships, merchandise deals, speaking engagements at social media conferences. Greg bought a decent apartment, then a nice car, then began traveling full-time, turning the world into his personal playground. His content became increasingly elaborate and expensive to produce. He hired a manager, then a small team. His laugh became more practiced, his stunts more calculated to generate maximum engagement. But somewhere along the way, the line between Greg the person and Greg the performance had blurred beyond recognition. He began to see every location, every interaction, every moment as potential content. Sacred spaces became backdrops, cultural traditions became props, local customs became punchlines. His audience rewarded this escalation with loyalty and attention that felt like love, even when he knew it was just entertainment consumption. The village of San Miguel de la Cruz had existed for over 600 years, nestled in a valley between rolling hills, covered in olive groves and vineyards. Its narrow cobblestone streets wound between buildings of honey-colored stone, their walls thick enough to keep homes cool in summer and warm in winter. Generations of families had lived, worked, and died within these same buildings, their stories etched into every weathered doorframe and worn threshold. The village's heart was its central plaza, dominated by a fountain that had provided fresh water since the 1400s. Around the plaza stood the essential buildings of community life: the small church of San Miguel, the town hall with its distinctive bell tower, Carmen's general store that had been in her family for 4 generations, and Eduardo's workshop, where he continued the stone-carving traditions his grandfather had taught him as a boy. Life in San Miguel moved according to rhythms established centuries ago. Shops opened early and closed for lunch. Children attended the small school taught by Senora Martinez, who had taught their parents before them. Evenings brought families together in the plaza, where old men played dominoes while children ran, between the fountain and their mother's watchful eyes. Sunday Mass at San Miguel Chapel was not just a religious obligation, but a social cornerstone, the one time each week when every member of the community gathered in the same space. The Virgin Mary statue stood in a small alcove beside the chapel, carved from local stone in 1920 by Eduardo's grandfather. It was not a masterpiece by any conventional artistic standard. The proportions were slightly imperfect, the facial features more earnest than elegant. But its imperfections made it beloved rather than merely admired. Villagers had been bringing their prayers, their troubles, and their gratitude to that statue for over a century. Fresh flowers appeared in her hands every few days, replaced by whoever felt moved to make the gesture. Small candles flickered at her feet, lit by people whose names and prayers only she knew. Father Miguel had been the chapel's priest for 37 years. At 68, his once black hair was now completely silver, his face lined by decades of listening to confessions and offering comfort. He moved slowly but with purpose, his hands steady from years of consecrating bread and wine, blessing the sick, and tending to the spiritual needs of people who trusted him with their deepest fears and hopes. He had baptized most of the village children, married many of them, and buried their parents and grandparents. His small quarters behind the chapel were sparse but comfortable, filled with well-worn books of theology and philosophy, and a few treasured photographs of seminary classmates and beloved parishioners who had passed on. Carmen Ruiz had inherited her family's store at 25 and run it for 30 years, through economic downturns, social changes, and the gradual drift of young people toward larger cities. At 55, she knew every family's preferences, their financial struggles, their celebrations and tragedies. Her store carried everything from basic groceries to hardware supplies, from children's toys to religious candles. She extended credit to families having tough times and somehow always managed to stock exactly what people needed, even before they knew they needed it. Her laugh was as much a fixture of the village as the fountain in the plaza. Eduardo Morales had learned stone carving from his grandfather, who had learned it from his father before him. At 62, his hands were permanently stained with stone dust, and his back curved from decades of bending over his work. But his skill had only deepened with age. He could look at a block of stone and see the figure waiting inside, then coax it out with patience and precision that younger men found impossible to match. His workshop walls displayed photographs of his work, monuments in distant cities, decorative elements for churches and public buildings, and countless small pieces created for local families to mark births, marriages, and memorials. These were the people whose lives Greg Lathrop disrupted when he arrived in San Miguel de la Cruz on a warm Tuesday morning in late September. His rented car loaded with camera equipment and his head full of content ideas. He had chosen the village because it looked perfectly picturesque in the travel guide photographs, authentic, untouched, exactly the kind of place his audience would find charmingly backward. He planned to spend 2 days filming content about traditional Spanish village life, poking gentle fun at the slower pace and old-fashioned customs before moving on to Barcelona for more urban adventures. Greg's phone, his constant companion and primary tool of his trade, buzzed continuously with notifications as he walked through the village that first day. Comments on his latest video, messages from his manager about upcoming brand partnerships, alerts from various social media platforms tracking his engagement metrics. The device was more than just a communication tool. It was his lifeline to relevance, his proof of existence in the only world that mattered to him anymore. But even as the notifications lit up his screen with validation and attention, Something felt different here in San Miguel. The silence between. The phone buzzes seemed deeper somehow. The afternoon light slanted through the narrow streets in ways that made him pause, though he couldn't articulate why. The faces of the villagers he passed carried a quality of presence that his camera struggled to capture. A sense that they were fully where they were, fully engaged with their immediate surroundings, in a way that felt foreign to someone whose attention was always partly scattered across multiple digital platforms. That evening, as Greg reviewed the day's footage in his hotel room in the nearest town, he realized his content felt flat. The village was beautiful. The people seemed kind, but there was no edge, no hook that would make his audience care. Beautiful scenery and pleasant interactions didn't generate the kind of engagement his sponsors expected. He needed something more provocative, more memorable, something that would cut through the endless scroll of content competing for attention. As he scrolled through his phone, checking engagement metrics on his recent videos and monitoring competitor content, Greg began planning his next day's filming. He needed a moment that would make people stop scrolling and pay attention. Something unexpected. Something that would give his audience the delicious thrill of seeing boundaries crossed and conventions challenged. His phone screen dimmed as he set it aside, but its presence remained like a weight on his chest, demanding to be fed with content that would satisfy algorithms hungry for engagement. Outside his hotel window, the village of San Miguel de la Cruz settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, unaware that tomorrow would bring a collision between two very different ways of understanding what mattered in the world. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of golden light that photographers dream about, but Greg barely noticed the beauty as he gathered his equipment. His manager had called early, reminding him that his last 3 videos had underperformed compared to his usual metrics. The pressure was building to create something that would recapture his audience's attention and satisfy the brand partnerships that funded his lifestyle. Greg walked through the village with his camera in hand, looking for the perfect setup. He filmed himself buying bread from Carmen's store, making exaggerated gestures about the ancient cash register and commenting on how quaint it was that she didn't accept digital payments. He wandered through Eduardo's workshop, filming the old man's tools and making jokes about prehistoric stone carving techniques. But even as he performed his usual routine, something felt forced. The content lacked the spark that had built his following. The morning sun climbed higher as Greg explored the narrow streets, his frustration growing. His audience expected him to find the absurd, the outrageous, the moment that would make them laugh and share. But San Miguel de la Cruz resisted easy mockery. The villagers were polite but reserved, going about their daily routines without providing the dramatic reactions that made for good content. Children played quietly in the plaza while their grandmothers watched from shaded benches. Men tended their small gardens behind stone walls. Women hung laundry on lines strung between ancient buildings. It was peaceful, functional, and entirely unsuitable for viral content. By noon, Greg's phone showed disappointing engagement numbers on his morning posts. Comments were sparse, views were climbing slowly, and the algorithmic indicators suggested his content wasn't resonating. He needed something bigger, something that would cut through the noise and remind his audience why they followed him in the first place. That's when he noticed the Virgin Mary statue. She stood in her alcove beside the chapel, hands clasped in prayer, eyes cast downward in an expression of serene compassion. Fresh marigolds had been placed in her stone hands, and 3 small candles flickered at her feet, despite the bright daylight. Greg had walked past her several times that morning without really seeing her, but now he paused, his content creator. Instincts awakening. The statue was perfect, clearly important to the local community, obviously sacred, completely defenseless. His audience loved content that challenged religious sensibilities, especially when it involved quaint foreign customs. He could already imagine the comments, the outraged reactions, the shares from people either loving or hating what he was about to do. Controversy drove engagement, and engagement paid his bills. Greg set up his camera on a small tripod, checking the angle to ensure both he and the statue would be clearly visible. He pulled a can of red spray paint from his backpack. He'd started carrying it for exactly these kinds of spontaneous opportunities. The can felt cool and solid in his hand, its weight somehow more significant than he'd expected. "Okay, guys," he said to the camera, flashing his signature grin. "We're here in this adorable little Spanish village, and I've found the most perfect example of how seriously these people take their—" He paused for effect, gesturing toward the statue, religious decorations. The spray paint can made a soft, rattling sound as he shook it, the metal ball bearing inside bouncing against the walls of the container. That small sound seemed to echo in the quiet plaza, though Greg was too focused on his performance to notice how it carried in the still air. "I mean, look at this thing," he continued, moving closer to the statue, with the camera following his movement. "It's literally just sitting here in the open, like it's some kind of priceless artwork or something. But here's what I think about taking things too seriously." The first spray of paint hit the statue's base with a sharp hiss. Red paint spread across the weathered stone in an irregular blob, brilliant and shocking against the gentle patina of age. Greg felt the familiar rush of transgression, the electric thrill of crossing a line that others wouldn't dare approach. His audience lived for these moments. "Oops," he said with mock innocence, grinning at the camera. "Butterfingers." But instead of stopping there, instead of settling for the single splash of paint that would have been enough to generate controversy, Greg felt the pressure to escalate. His recent videos had been too tame, too careful. He needed to remind his audience that he was still the guy who would do anything for their entertainment. He sprayed again, this time across the statue's robes, then across her folded hands. The paint covered the fresh marigolds, dripping onto the cobblestones, where the votive candles still flickered. The acrid smell of aerosol paint mixed with the warm scents of bread and flowers that had defined the plaza moments before. "There we go," Greg said, stepping back to admire his work. "A little modern art to brighten up this dusty old—" "¿Qué está haciendo?" The voice came from behind him, sharp with shock and disbelief. Greg spun around to find an elderly woman, standing at the edge of the plaza, her face pale and her hands pressed to her mouth. Maria Santos, the village elder, had been returning from the market when she witnessed the desecration. For a moment, Greg felt a flicker of something that might have been shame. The woman's expression wasn't angry. It was heartbroken. She stared at the defaced statue like she was watching a beloved family member being hurt. But Greg quickly pushed that feeling aside. This was exactly the kind of authentic reaction that would make great content. "It's okay, senora," he said, switching to the basic Spanish he'd learned for travel. "Just a little art project." Maria Santos didn't respond to his words. Instead, she began to cry, not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary sadness. She approached the statue slowly, reaching out toward the paint-covered stone, as if she might be able to somehow restore it with her touch. Other villagers began to appear, drawn by Maria's distress and the unusual commotion in the normally peaceful plaza. Carmen emerged from her store, Eduardo from his workshop, several mothers with their children. They formed a small crowd around the statue, speaking in rapid Spanish that Greg's limited vocabulary couldn't follow. But their tone was unmistakable. This wasn't just vandalism to them. It was a violation of something sacred. Greg kept his camera rolling, capturing the villagers' reactions. This was perfect content, genuine emotion, cultural conflict, the kind of real-world drama that his audience craved. But as he filmed, something in the villagers' faces made him increasingly uncomfortable. There was no performative outrage, no theatrical anger, just genuine grief, as if he had damaged something irreplaceable. "Listen," he said, raising his voice to address the growing crowd. "It's just paint. It'll wash off. No harm done, right?" But even as he spoke, Greg realized the paint was already beginning to soak into the porous stone. What had seemed like a harmless prank was becoming permanent damage. The statue that had weathered decades of sun and rain was now marked with bright red paint that seemed to glow against the weathered stone like a wound. Someone must have called the police, because within minutes Greg heard the sound of a car engine approaching through the narrow streets. A pair of local officers emerged from a small patrol car, their expressions serious as they surveyed the scene. The senior officer, a man in his 50s with graying temples, looked from Greg to the statue to the assembled villagers, taking in the situation with professional calm. The conversation that followed happened mostly in Spanish, with Greg understanding only fragments. But he didn't need translation to grasp that his situation had become serious very quickly. The officers examined his passport, spoke at length with the villagers, and photographed the statue from multiple angles. When they finally addressed Greg directly in accented English, their message was clear: he would need to come with them. As Greg was led to the police car, his camera still recording from the tripod where he'd left it, he caught sight of Maria Santos again. She was kneeling beside the statue now, her weathered hands touching the painted stone with infinite gentleness, whispering what sounded like prayers or apologies. The image struck him with unexpected force. This elderly woman treating the damaged statue as if it were a wounded person, as if his moment of calculated irreverence had caused actual measurable harm to something she loved. The security camera mounted on the corner of the town hall had captured everything, creating a permanent record of the incident that would soon spread far beyond Greg's intended audience. But as the police car pulled away from the plaza, carrying him toward consequences he was only beginning to understand, Greg's last clear view was of the villagers gathered around their defaced statue, their faces reflecting a kind of sorrow he had never encountered in all his years of manufactured controversy. The holding cell in the regional police station was nothing like the dramatic jail scenes Greg had seen in movies. It was simply a small, clean room with white walls, a narrow window, and a single bed with crisp sheets. But the mundane surroundings couldn't diminish the reality of his situation. The door was locked, his passport was gone, and he was entirely at the mercy of a legal system he didn't understand in a country whose language he barely spoke. Greg spent his first night in custody, scrolling through his phone, watching the video of his vandalism spread across social media platforms. But instead of the supportive comments and outraged engagement he'd expected, the responses were overwhelmingly negative. His usual defenders seemed absent, replaced by viewers expressing disgust at his actions. The algorithm that had once favored his content now seemed to be burying it, reducing his reach just when he needed it most. "Dude crossed a line this time," read one typical comment. "Making fun of random stuff is one thing, but this is just disrespectful." Another viewer wrote, "Used to love this guy's content, but this ain't it. Grow up." The shift in public opinion was swift and decisive, leaving Greg feeling more isolated than he'd ever been in his years of online fame. The next morning brought Isabella Rodriguez, a court-appointed cultural liaison who spoke perfect English and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with international incidents. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair pulled back in a professional bun. Her role, she explained, was to help foreign visitors understand Spanish legal procedures when cultural crimes were involved. "Cultural crimes?" Greg asked, confused. "I thought this was just vandalism." Isabella opened a folder containing photographs of the statue, both before and after his attack. "In Spain, we have specific laws protecting cultural and religious heritage. When you damaged that statue, you didn't just commit vandalism. You committed an offense against the cultural patrimony of the Spanish people." She spread several documents across the small table between them, pointing to specific sections highlighted in yellow. "The statue may seem simple to you, but it's been part of that community for over a century. It's protected under both local ordinances and national heritage laws. The penalties can be quite severe. Greg's phone buzzed with another notification, but for once he ignored it. The legal terminology and formal language in the documents was intimidating in a way his usual brushes with authority had never been. Campus security guards and local police dealing with his stunts had always been manageable problems, resolved with apologies and sometimes small fines. This felt different, heavier, more permanent. "What kind of penalties?" he asked. Isabella's expression remained neutral and professional. "That depends on several factors. The extent of the damage, your attitude toward making amends, the community's willingness to accept restitution. Judge Morales will make the final determination, but I can tell you that she takes cultural heritage very seriously." That afternoon, Isabella took Greg through his family history, apparently a standard part of the cultural mediation process. He found himself talking about his childhood in Phoenix, his parents' divorce when he was 12, his mother's increasing involvement with the local Catholic Church after the split. His father had been dismissive of his mother's faith, calling it a crutch for people too weak to face reality. Greg realized he'd absorbed some of that attitude without really thinking about it. "Your mother passed away recently?" Isabella asked, reading from her notes. "2 years ago. Cancer." The words came out flat, emotionless. Greg had gotten good at delivering that information without feeling anything. His mother's death had coincided with his rise to internet fame, and he'd thrown himself into content creation as a way of avoiding the grief. "Who were you close?" Greg considered the question honestly. "We used to be, when I was a kid, but after the divorce, and especially after I dropped out of college." He shrugged. "She wanted me to be something I wasn't. More responsible, I guess. More like the person she thought I should be." Isabella made notes as he spoke, her pen moving steadily across the paper. "And now, how do you think she would feel about what happened yesterday?" The question hit Greg unexpectedly hard. His mother had always been disappointed by his choices, but she'd never stopped loving him. Even during their worst arguments, even when months passed between their phone calls, she'd continued sending him birthday cards and Christmas presents. The image of her seeing that video, watching him spray paint a religious statue while laughing, was almost unbearable. "She would have been ashamed," he said quietly. "She would have been really, really ashamed." That evening, Greg called his manager from the police station. The conversation was brief and unpleasant. Brand partnerships were being cancelled, sponsorship deals were falling through, and his management company was considering dropping him entirely. His agent's advice was to lay low, let this blow over, and maybe consider a sincere apology video once you're back in the States. But Greg wasn't sure when he'd be back in the States. Isabella had been clear that leaving the country while charges were pending was not an option. His passport would remain in police custody until the legal process was complete, which could take weeks or even months. He tried calling his father, but the conversation was even worse than the one with his manager. His father was angry about the potential legal expenses and embarrassed by the media attention. "This is exactly the kind of stupid stunt I'd expect from you," he said. "Your mother always said you'd end up in real trouble someday, and I guess she was right." The mention of his mother stung, partly because it was true, and partly because it came from his father, who had never understood her faith and had mocked her religious practices throughout their marriage. Greg found himself defending her memory, though he wasn't sure why. "She wasn't stupid for believing in something," he said. "At least she cared about something bigger than herself." "Yeah, well, look where all that caring got her," his father replied. "And look where your caring about internet fame has gotten you. Maybe it's time to grow up and think about consequences before you act." After hanging up, Greg sat on his narrow bed and looked out through the small window at the Spanish countryside. Rolling hills covered in olive groves stretched to the horizon, peaceful and timeless in the evening light. For the first time in years, he had nowhere to go, no content to create, no audience demanding his attention. The silence felt strange and unsettling. His phone buzzed again. Another notification, another metric, another demand for his attention. But instead of checking it immediately, Greg set the device aside and continued looking out the window. Somewhere beyond those hills was the village of San Miguel de la Cruz, where an old woman had cried over a painted statue and an entire community had looked at him like he'd broken something precious and irreplaceable. Maybe he had. Judge Esperanza Morales commanded respect the moment she entered the courtroom. In her mid-60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades weighing the complexities of human nature against the requirements of law. Her courtroom was small but formal, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in streams of golden morning light. Isabella had prepared Greg for the hearing by explaining Spanish legal procedures, but he still felt overwhelmed by the formal language and ceremonial atmosphere. The judge spoke primarily in Spanish, with Isabella providing translation, but Greg could sense the gravity of the proceedings even when he couldn't understand the words. The evidence was straightforward and damning. Security camera footage showed Greg's actions clearly, from the moment he set up his camera to the final spray of paint across the statue's hands. Photographs documented the damage, showing how the aerosol paint had soaked into the porous stone, making it potentially impossible to remove completely. Statements from villagers described the statue's cultural and spiritual significance to their community. Judge Morales asked Greg several questions through Isabella's translation. Did he understand the significance of what he had damaged? Did he comprehend the difference between public property and cultural heritage? Was he prepared to make meaningful amends for his actions? Greg's answers felt inadequate, even as he gave them. Yes, he understood he had made a mistake. Yes, he was sorry for the damage. Yes, he wanted to make things right. But the words felt hollow, more like responses he thought the judge wanted to hear than expressions of genuine understanding or remorse. The sentence, when it came, was more complex than Greg had expected. Rather than simply imposing a fine or jail time, Judge Morales had crafted what Isabella called a cultural restitution program. Greg would remain in Spain for a minimum of 3 months, during which time he would perform community service specifically related to cultural and religious preservation. He would live and work at the San Miguel Chapel under the supervision of Father Miguel, participating in the daily maintenance and care of the building and grounds. The goal, Judge Morales explained through Isabella, is not punishment, but education. You will learn the value of what you damaged by helping to preserve similar treasures. The court documents were official and intimidating, filled with legal language that made Greg's obligations clear. He was required to work 40 hours per week on chapel maintenance, attend weekly meetings with Isabella to discuss his cultural education, and submit monthly reports on his progress. Any violation of these terms would result in immediate jail time and potentially more serious charges. After the hearing, Isabella drove Greg to San Miguel de la Cruz in her small, practical car. The drive took less than an hour, but it felt like a journey to another world. Greg watched the countryside roll past, olive groves and vineyards, small farms with stone walls, hills dotted with wind turbines that turned slowly in the afternoon breeze. His phone had no signal for most of the drive, leaving him disconnected from the digital world that had defined his existence for the past 3 years. Father Miguel is a good man, Isabella said as they drove. He volunteered to supervise your service when other options fell through. The village was reluctant to host you, given what happened, Greg could imagine. He'd become a symbol of everything they disliked about modern tourists: disrespectful, entitled, treating their home as a backdrop for entertainment. The thought of spending 3 months surrounded by people who saw him that way was deeply uncomfortable. The chapel was smaller than Greg remembered from his brief visit during the vandalism incident. Built of the same honey-colored stone as the rest of the village, it had thick walls and small windows that created a sense of cool shelter from the warm afternoon sun. A bell tower rose above the main building, and a small garden with olive trees and flowering bushes stretched behind the structure. Father Miguel was waiting for them in the chapel's main room, a simple space with wooden pews, stone floors, and an altar adorned with fresh flowers and burning candles. At 68, the priest moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body had served him faithfully for many years, but required gentle treatment. His handshake was firm, his eyes kind but evaluating. "Welcome," he said, in heavily accented English. "Isabella has explained your situation. We will do our best to help you understand what you have damaged, and perhaps more importantly, why it mattered to people you have never met." Greg's living quarters were Spartan, a small room above the chapel with a narrow bed, a wooden desk, a chair, and a tiny window that looked out over the village plaza. The walls were white plaster, unadorned except for a simple wooden cross. Above the bed, a small bathroom down the hall contained a shower, toilet, and sink. There was no television, no air conditioning, no Wi-Fi. Just silence, stone walls, and the distant sound of church bells marking the hours. Father Miguel showed Greg around the chapel, explaining the daily routines that would structure his new life. Morning prayers at 6, followed by breakfast and work assignments. Lunch at noon, then more work until evening prayers at 6, dinner afterward, then personal time until lights out at 10. It was a schedule that left no room for the chaotic, unstructured lifestyle that had characterized Greg's recent years. "The work is simple but important," Father Miguel explained, showing Greg the supply closet where cleaning materials and tools were stored. "We maintain this building not just because it is beautiful, but because it serves our community. Every stone, every window, every piece of wood has been cared for by generations of faithful people. You will learn to see it as they saw it." That first evening, Greg tried to create content about his situation, setting up his phone to record a video explaining his temporary setback to his audience. But the words felt wrong in the quiet chapel setting. His usual energy and humor seemed inappropriate, almost sacrilegious. He recorded several attempts, deleting each one as soon as he finished. Instead, he found himself simply sitting on his narrow bed, looking out the small window at the plaza where the vandalized statue stood. Even in the gathering darkness, he could make out its silhouette, the red paint still visible as darker patches on the weathered stone. A few villagers passed through the plaza during the evening, some pausing to light candles at the statue's base despite the damage. Greg's phone buzzed occasionally with notifications, but the messages felt distant and irrelevant. His manager was fielding calls from lawyers and publicists. His remaining brand partners were asking about his return timeline. His father had sent a terse text asking if he needed money for legal expenses, but none of it seemed to connect to his current reality. This small room, this ancient building, this community he had harmed and would now somehow have to face every day for the next 3 months. As the chapel bells rang 9 o'clock, Greg realized he was more truly alone than he had been since childhood. No audience, no cameras, no digital validation to distract him from the quiet voice in his head, asking uncomfortable questions about who he had become and why. The alarm clock in Greg's small room above the chapel had no snooze button, just a persistent mechanical ringing that pulled him from sleep at 5:30 each morning. His first week of community service established a routine that felt foreign. To someone accustomed to sleeping until noon and structuring his days around content creation rather than physical labor. After morning prayers with Father Miguel, during which Greg stood respectfully but didn't participate, he received his daily work assignment. The tasks were humble but necessary. Sweeping stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, polishing wooden pews that generations of villagers had touched in prayer and contemplation, washing windows that filtered morning light into patterns. of gold and amber across the chapel's interior. The work tools became familiar extensions of his hands, a worn broom with soft bristles perfect for the ancient stone, a bucket that had been mended several times but still held water without leaking, cleaning cloths that Father Miguel had cut from old sheets donated by parishioners. These simple implements felt different from any tools Greg had used before. Unlike his camera equipment, which was designed to capture moments and convert them into content, these tools served only to preserve and maintain something already beautiful. Greg's hands, soft from years of primarily digital work, began to develop. Calluses from the broom handle and cleaning brushes. His back ached from bending to scrub floors and reach high windows. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the physical labor began to feel meditative rather than burdensome. There was something soothing about work that required his complete attention, but no creativity or performance. No one would see these clean floors, except the villagers who came to pray. No one would praise his polished pews on social media. The work existed for its own sake. During his second week, Carmen from the village store began nodding to him when he passed by her window while walking to the chapel each morning. It wasn't friendly exactly, but it was an acknowledgement of his presence that felt significant after days of being invisible to the villagers. When he needed cleaning supplies that the chapel lacked, she served him with professional courtesy, accepting his halting Spanish attempts with patience, if not warmth. "Thank you," he would say after each purchase, and she would nod curtly before turning to the next customer. But Greg noticed she always gave him exact change and included a receipt, small gestures that suggested she was treating him as a legitimate customer rather than an unwelcome intruder. Eduardo's workshop stood directly across from the chapel, and Greg often saw the elderly stone carver through the open door, bent over his work with tools that looked centuries old. Sometimes Eduardo would pause in his carving to watch Greg sweeping the chapel steps or tending the small garden behind the building. Their eyes would meet briefly before Eduardo returned to his work, but Greg sensed evaluation rather than hostility. In the older man's gaze, the village children were the most openly curious about Greg's presence. They would gather at the edge of the plaza while he worked outside the chapel, whispering to each other and giggling at his attempts to pronounce basic words. When he tried to say good morning to a group of them one morning, his accent was apparently so terrible that they burst into delighted laughter. But it was friendly laughter, the kind that invited him to laugh along rather than driving him away. Father Miguel proved to be a patient teacher, explaining not just what needed to be done, but why it mattered. "This stone," he said one morning, as Greg scrubbed the chapel steps, was cut from quarries in these hills over 400 years ago. The men who laid it are buried in the cemetery behind the church. Their great-great-grandchildren still attend services here. When you clean these steps, you honor their work and prepare the way for future generations. These conversations happened in the spaces between work tasks, while they ate simple meals together or during the quiet hour after evening prayers when Father Miguel would sit in his favorite chair and Greg would join him reluctantly at first, then with growing comfort. The priest had a way of speaking that made even mundane topics feel weighty, with meaning. "You understand social media," Father Miguel said one evening. "Help me comprehend. Why do people watch videos of strangers doing foolish things?" Greg tried to explain the psychology of viral content, the way algorithms rewarded engagement and controversy, how audiences craved entertainment that felt more authentic than traditional media. But as he spoke, his explanations began to sound hollow, even to himself. The excitement and validation that had driven his content creation felt distant and artificial in the quiet chapel setting. "And this brought you satisfaction?" Father Miguel asked, "making others laugh at foolish behavior." "It brought me money," Greg said honestly, "and attention. People knew who I was. I mattered to them. But did they know you, or did they know the person you performed for their entertainment?" The question haunted Greg as he continued his daily routines. His attempts to create content about his situation continued to fail. The videos he recorded felt forced and inauthentic, lacking the energy and spontaneity that had built his following. His audience was losing interest, his view counts dropping steadily as he failed to maintain the constant stream of engaging content that social media algorithms demanded. More troubling was his growing indifference to these metrics. The numbers that had once defined his self-worth, followers, views, engagement rates, began to feel abstract and meaningless. When his phone died during his third week and he didn't bother charging it for several hours, Greg realized he hadn't missed the constant notifications and updates that had once seemed essential to his survival. Instead, he found himself paying attention to other rhythms, the way morning light moved across the chapel floor as the sun rose, the sound of villagers' conversations in the plaza as they went about their daily routines, the smell of bread from Carmen's, storm mixing with the scent of candles and incense from the chapel. These sensory experiences weren't content to be captured and shared. They simply existed, requiring nothing from him except presence and attention. One morning, while sweeping the chapel steps, Greg noticed fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the vandalized statue, despite the red paint that still marked the stone. Someone continued to bring marigolds and light candles for their prayers. The sight stopped him mid-sweep, struck by the realization that his destructive act hadn't destroyed the statue's meaning for the people who cherished it. Their faith and devotion continued unchanged, perhaps even deepened by having to love something wounded. The image stayed with him as he finished his morning work, a reminder that some things possessed value that couldn't be diminished by mockery or damage. As he carried his cleaning tools back into the chapel's cool interior, Greg found himself wondering what it would feel like to care about something with that kind of unshakable dedication. It was during his fourth week in San Miguel that Greg found his mother's rosary. He had been searching through his old backpack for a phone charger when his fingers encountered the familiar weight of wooden beads wrapped in tissue paper. For a moment, he simply held the small bundle, remembering the last time he'd seen it, packed hurriedly during his move from Phoenix, when he'd grabbed everything from his childhood bedroom without paying attention to what he was taking, unwrapping. The tissue revealed the rosary, exactly as he remembered it, dark wood beads worn smooth by his mother's fingers, a simple silver cross, the scent of her perfume still faintly clinging to the cord. She had carried this rosary to Mass every Sunday for as long as Greg could remember, her lips moving silently through the prayers while he fidgeted beside her in the pew, counting minutes until they could leave. The discovery triggered a flood of memories Greg had been successfully avoiding for 2 years. His mother teaching him to make the sign of the cross when he was 5, her patient explanations of Bible stories he found boring, her gentle insistence that they attend Easter and Christmas services even after his father had stopped going entirely. He remembered her praying this rosary in the hospital during her final weeks, the beads sliding through her thin fingers while machines beeped softly around her bed. "She never stopped praying for you," his aunt had told him at the funeral, "even when you two weren't speaking, even when she was worried about your choices. She said God would bring you back to what mattered eventually." That evening, Greg sat in his small room holding the rosary, trying to remember the prayers his mother had attempted to teach him. The words came back in fragments: "Hail Mary, full of grace," and "Our Father who art in heaven," but he couldn't recall the complete sequences or understand how the beads were supposed to guide the prayer sequence. It was like having half a map to a destination he wasn't sure he wanted to reach. The next morning brought a new work assignment, helping Eduardo repair damaged stonework on the chapel's exterior wall. Father Miguel explained that Eduardo had volunteered to teach Greg basic stone restoration techniques as part of his cultural education. It was the first time Greg would work directly with someone other than the priest, and he approached Eduardo's workshop with nervous anticipation. Eduardo's workspace was a study in organized chaos. Stone blocks and carved fragments filled every available surface. Tools hung on walls in arrangements that clearly made sense to their owner, and sketches of architectural details were tacked to a bulletin board near the window. The air smelled of stone dust and mineral oil, with undertones of coffee from the pot that seemed to brew continuously in the corner. "So," Eduardo said in careful English, "you want to learn to fix what you have broken." The directness of the question caught Greg off guard. Most of the villagers had been politely distant, avoiding any mention of his crime. Eduardo's willingness to address it directly felt like a relief and a challenge simultaneously. "I want to learn," Greg said. "I don't know if I can fix what I broke, but I want to try." Eduardo studied him for a long moment, then nodded toward a workbench where several tools were laid out. "We start with simple things. Stone is patient but unforgiving. You cannot take back a wrong cut, only work with what remains." The tools felt heavy and purposeful in Greg's hands. Chisels with edges worn to perfect sharpness through decades of use. Hammers weighted for precision rather than power. Brushes for clearing away debris and dust. Eduardo demonstrated proper techniques with movements that were economical and precise, the result of 62 years of practice. "Feel the grain," Eduardo instructed as Greg attempted his first careful cuts on a practice stone. "Each piece has its own character. You must listen to what it tells you." Greg's early attempts were clumsy and frustrating. The chisel skittered across the stone surface, leaving rough scratches instead of clean cuts. His hands cramped from gripping the tools too tightly, and stone chips flew in directions that made Eduardo wince and step aside. But gradually, over the course of several days, Greg began to understand what Eduardo meant about listening to the stone. Each piece of limestone had subtle variations in density and grain, characteristics that determined how it would respond to cutting tools. Learning to read these variations required patience and attention that reminded Greg of meditation, though he'd never been interested in meditation before. The work demanded complete presence. Any distraction could result in a ruined cut or an injured finger. "My grandfather carved the statue you damaged," Eduardo mentioned casually during their second week of working together. The comment was delivered without accusation or anger, simply as information, but it hit Greg like a physical blow. Greg's chisel slipped, gouging an ugly scratch in the practice stone he'd been carefully shaping. He set down his tools and looked at Eduardo, who continued working as if he'd mentioned the weather. "I didn't know," Greg said quietly. "Why would you know?" Eduardo shrugged. "Tourists do not ask about such things. They see old statue. They think it is just decoration." No, the casual acceptance in Eduardo's voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. Greg had expected hostility, perhaps even hatred from the villagers. Instead, he found resignation, the weary tolerance of people who had watched thoughtless outsiders come and go for generations, leaving damage behind them. "Tell me about him," Greg said. "Your grandfather." Eduardo paused in his work, considering whether the question was worth answering. Finally, he set down his tools and walked to the bulletin board, where old photographs were pinned among his sketches. He selected a small black and white image and handed it to Greg. The photograph showed a young man in work clothes standing beside a partially carved statue. Even in the faded image, Greg could see the careful attention in the carver's posture, the way he held his tools with respect and precision. "Eduardo Morales," the older man said. "My name comes from him. He learned stone carving from his father, who learned from his father before. The statue took him 6 months to complete, working in the evenings after his regular job. He made it for the village because they needed something beautiful to pray with. No payment, just love for his neighbors." Greg studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the young man's earnest face with the vandalized statue in the plaza. Why did he make it look humble, not like the perfect statues in big churches? "Because perfect is not the same as beautiful," Eduardo replied. "He carved it to look like someone the village mothers could pray to, someone who would understand their troubles. My grandfather said art should serve the people, not impress them. As their daily work sessions continued, Eduardo shared more family history. His grandfather had also carved architectural elements for the chapel, memorial stones for the cemetery, and decorative pieces for village celebrations. Each project had been approached with the same quiet dedication, creating beauty that would outlast its maker by generations. You know what he told me when I was learning? Eduardo asked one afternoon as they cleaned their tools. He said the stone remembers everything you do to it. Every cut, every polish, every mistake. So you must work with respect, because your intentions become part of the final piece. The comment stayed with Greg that evening as he sat in his room, holding his mother's rosary and looking out at the plaza. The vandalized statue was visible in the moonlight, its red paint scars dark against the weathered stone. But now he saw it differently, not just as an object he had damaged, but as the physical manifestation of one man's love for his community, created with the same careful attention Eduardo was teaching him to bring to his own work. Greg's social media presence continued to deteriorate during this period. His follower count dropped steadily as he failed to maintain regular content, and his attempts to create videos about his authentic Spanish experience fell flat. The forced enthusiasm and manufactured conflict that had built his audience felt impossible to summon in his current circumstances. More concerning was his growing indifference to these failures. The metrics that had once determined his mood and self-worth began to feel like measurements from another person's life. When his manager called to discuss damage control strategies and potential comeback videos, Greg found himself struggling to care about audience retention rates and brand recovery timelines. Instead, he found meaning in small improvements to his stoneworking skills, in Father Miguel's approving nod when he completed a task without reminders, in Carmen's gradual warming from professional politeness to something approaching friendliness. These interactions weren't content to be monetized or shared. They simply existed, requiring nothing from him except genuine presence and effort. One evening, while Eduardo was teaching him to sharpen chisels, Greg found the courage to ask the question that had been haunting him. "Do you think your grandfather's statue can be restored?" Eduardo was quiet for so long that Greg wondered if he'd overstepped. Finally, the older man spoke. "The paint, maybe it can be removed with special treatments. The stone, it is strong. But the damage to trust, to respect, that is harder to repair." "What would it take," Greg asked, "to repair the trust?" Eduardo looked at him directly for the first time since they'd begun working together. "Time, work, proof that you understand what you harmed. Maybe then the stone will forgive you, even if some people cannot." As Greg fell asleep that night, his mother's rosary on the nightstand beside his bed, he found himself hoping Eduardo was right about forgiveness. Not because he needed it from the villagers, though he did, but because he was beginning to need it from himself. Greg had been working with Eduardo for 3 weeks when the old photograph changed everything. They were organizing Eduardo's collection of family documents and historical images, preparing to create a display about traditional stone carving techniques for the village's annual feast day celebration. Eduardo moved slowly through the boxes, handling each photograph with the reverence of someone touching sacred relics. "This one," Eduardo said, pulling out a larger photograph than the others, "shows the statue being installed in 1920. Greg accepted the black and white image, expecting another glimpse of Eduardo's grandfather at work. Instead, he found himself looking at a ceremony that involved the entire village. Men in their Sunday best stood alongside women in traditional dress, children peering between their parents' legs, elderly villagers leaning on walking sticks. At the center of the gathering stood the Virgin Mary statue, newly carved and gleaming pale in the photographer's flash. But it was the background of the photograph that stopped Greg's breathing. Behind the celebrating villagers, he could see crosses, rows upon rows of simple wooden crosses stretching into the distance. The statue wasn't being installed in the peaceful plaza he knew. It was being placed in what was clearly a cemetery, surrounded by fresh graves. "Eduardo," Greg said carefully, "where was this picture taken?" "In the old cemetery, behind where the chapel stands now. The statue lived there first, before we moved it to the plaza in 1955. Eduardo's finger traced the rows of crosses visible in the photograph. Those are the graves of the village men who died in the Civil War. 23 young fathers and sons, killed in a single battle just outside San Miguel in 1919. Greg studied the photograph more closely, counting the crosses and noting the ages carved into the simple wooden markers. Most of the dead had been between 18 and 30 years old. An entire generation of the village's men, wiped out in a conflict that had ended just months before. The statue was completed. My grandfather made the Virgin Mary to watch over them, Eduardo continued. The families, they had no money for fancy monuments, no way to honor their dead except with prayers and flowers. So my grandfather carved them a guardian, someone to keep vigil over their graves and comfort the mothers and wives who came to visit. The revelation recontextualized everything Greg thought he understood about his crime. The statue wasn't just a religious decoration or cultural artifact. It was a memorial to war dead, a gravestone for an entire generation of young men who had died defending their community. His spray paint hadn't just vandalized public property. It had desecrated a monument to sacrifice and loss that was profoundly personal to every family in San Miguel. "The plague," Eduardo said, pointing to a small metal plaque visible at the statue's base in the photograph. "Can you read what it says?" Greg squinted at the weathered text. His Spanish had improved during his weeks in the village, but the formal language of the inscription challenged him. With Eduardo's help, he slowly translated, "In memory of the sons of San Miguel de la Cruz, who gave their lives so that freedom might live. May the Virgin Mary watch over them in eternal rest and comfort those who mourn them still." "Those who mourn them still," Greg repeated. "In 1920, my grandfather lost 2 brothers in that battle," Eduardo explained. "His father lost 3 sons. When he carved the statue, it was not just art, it was grief made visible, hope carved into stone. He worked on it at night after his regular job by candlelight, because he said the Virgin Mary needed to be beautiful enough to deserve the boys she was protecting." Eduardo pulled out more photographs from the box. Images of the statue's ceremonial move from the cemetery to the plaza in 1955, pictures of annual memorial services held at its base, shots of village children learning about their history while standing before the carved figure. In every image, the statue served as a focal point for community memory and collective mourning. "Why did they move it from the cemetery?" Greg asked. "The cemetery was getting crowded and the village was growing. But also," Eduardo paused, selecting his words carefully, "the old people wanted the young people to see the statue every day, not just when they visited graves. They wanted the memory of those boys to be part of daily life, not just something you encountered in sadness." As Eduardo continued sharing the statue's history, Greg felt the full weight of his transgression settling on him like a physical burden. He hadn't just vandalized a religious symbol, he had desecrated a war memorial, mocked the sacrifice of young men whose names were still remembered by their descendants living in the village. The elderly woman who had cried when she saw the damage was likely mourning not just an abstract concept of sacrilege, but the specific memory of grandfathers and great-uncles whose graves the statue had once protected. "Maria Santos," Eduardo said, as if reading Greg's thoughts, "lost her grandfather and 2 great-uncles in that battle. When she saw what you had done to the statue, it was like watching someone spray paint their tombstones." Greg set down the photographs with shaking hands. The casual cruelty of his actions felt overwhelming now that he understood their context. He had laughed while defacing a memorial to dead soldiers, filmed himself vandalizing a monument to grief and sacrifice that had sustained a community through decades of mourning. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" Greg asked. "Why didn't anyone explain what it really meant?" Eduardo shrugged, with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining obvious truths to confused outsiders. "Would it have mattered? Before? You came here before you started working with your hands. Would you have understood what we were telling you?" The question hung in the air between them. Greg forced himself to consider it honestly. 3 months ago, if someone had tried to explain the statue's significance, would he have changed his mind? Or would he have simply found the story of war memorial and community grief to be additional material for his content, another angle to exploit for engagement and views? "No," he admitted. "I probably would have thought it made better content. More dramatic backstory for the video." "Yes," Eduardo said without condemnation. "So we let the work teach you instead. Stone is patient. It waits for students to become ready for its lessons." That evening, Greg couldn't sleep. He lay on his narrow bed looking at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his vandalism incident with his new understanding of what he had actually done. The laughter in his voice as he shook the spray paint can, the casual dismissal of the statue as religious decoration, the joke about adding modern art to dusty old traditions. Most haunting was the memory of Maria Santos approaching the damaged statue, her hands reaching out as if she could heal it through touch. Now he understood that she wasn't just mourning abstract sacrilege. She was watching someone desecrate the memorial to her family's dead, watching a stranger mock the sacrifice that had defined her community's identity for over a century. Around midnight, Greg gave up on sleep and walked quietly down to the chapel's main room. The space was dark except for the eternal flame that burned beside the altar and the small votive candles left by evening visitors. He knelt in the back pew, not to pray. He still didn't know how to pray properly, but simply to sit with the weight of what he had learned. In the morning, he would have to face Eduardo again, would have to continue learning stone carving techniques while knowing that every skill he acquired was connected to a tradition of memorial and mourning that he had violated. He would have to walk through the village plaza, past the statue, whose significance he now fully understood, under the eyes of people whose ancestors' sacrifice he had unknowingly mocked. But perhaps most difficult of all, he would have to find a way to live with the knowledge that his mother, who had prayed for him with the rosary now sitting on his nightstand, who had died hoping he would find his way back to respect and reverence, would have been devastated by what he had done to someone else's sacred memorial. The candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Somewhere in those shadows, Greg thought he could almost sense the presence of all the people who had knelt in this space over the centuries, bringing their grief and hope to a place that promised to hold both safely. Tomorrow, he would begin the long work of earning the right to be among them. The morning after Eduardo's revelation about the statue's true history, Greg approached the stone carver's workshop with a request that surprised them both in its desperation and sincerity. "Teach me to carve a replacement," he said without preamble, standing in the doorway with his hands clenched at his sides. "I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can create something new, something worthy of what your grandfather made." Eduardo looked up from the architectural detail he was working on, a decorative column capital destined for a church renovation in a neighboring town. His weathered hands continued their precise movements with the chisel while he considered. "Greg's request. You have been working with stone for 3 weeks, Eduardo said finally. "My grandfather apprenticed for 7 years before attempting anything as complex as a human figure. What makes you think you're ready for such work?" "I'm not ready," Greg admitted. "I may never be ready, but I have to try. I have to do something more than just maintaining buildings and cleaning floors. I need to create something that honors what I destroyed." Eduardo set down his tools and studied Greg's face, looking for signs of the performative enthusiasm that had characterized his early weeks in the village. Instead, he found something that looked like genuine anguish, the expression of someone confronting the full weight of irreversible consequences. It would take months of intensive work, Eduardo warned. Your hands would bleed, your back would ache from bending over the carving. Many attempts would fail before you produced anything acceptable, and even if you succeeded, the village might never accept a replacement made by the person who destroyed the original. Then at least I'll have tried, Greg said. At least I'll have learned what it means to create something instead of just mocking what other people made. Eduardo was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Greg's face and the tools hanging on his workshop walls. Finally, he nodded slowly. We will attempt it, he said, but you must understand this is not therapy for your guilt. This is not content for your internet audience. This is an offering to the dead, and the dead do not forgive careless work. The stone Eduardo selected for the project was a block of local limestone, similar in composition and color to the original statue, but larger and more flawless. It had been quarried from the same hills that had provided material for the chapel and other village buildings, connecting the new work to the geological history of the region. First, Eduardo said, running his hands over the rough-cut surface, you must learn to see what lives inside the stone. This is not about imposing your will on the material. This is about discovering what wants to emerge and helping it find its form. Greg's initial attempts at seeing potential in the blank stone block were frustrating exercises in imagination. Where Eduardo could point to subtle variations in the rock's grain and describe how they would inform the final sculpture's details, Greg saw only an intimidating mass of limestone that seemed to resist his efforts to envision any transformation. But as they worked together day after day, something began to shift in Greg's perception. The block ceased to be an obstacle and became a collaboration partner. He learned to feel for weak points in the stone's structure, to recognize areas where the limestone would accept detailed carving and areas where it would crumble under too much pressure. Eduardo's teaching methods were rigorous and unforgiving. He demonstrated techniques once, expected Greg to remember them, and offered correction only when mistakes threatened to ruin irreplaceable work. There were no participation trophies in stone carving, no encouragement for effort that didn't produce results. The work itself was the only judge that mattered. Your fingers must remember what your eyes see, Eduardo explained, as Greg struggled with the delicate work around what would become the statue's face. When you are carving details, you cannot look at your hands and the stone at the same time. The tools become extensions of your intentions. Greg's hands, already calloused from his chapel maintenance work, developed new injuries from the intensive carving. Blisters formed and broke and formed again as he learned to grip chisels for hours at a time. His fingernails split from stone dust and pressure. His knuckles bled from accidental impacts with rough edges. But instead of discouraging him, these physical costs seemed to focus his attention in ways that mental effort alone couldn't achieve. The work demanded complete presence. Unlike his previous life, where part of his attention was always monitoring social media notifications and audience, engagement, stone carving, required absolute focus on the immediate moment. A momentary distraction could result in a ruined detail that would take days to repair, if repair was even possible. As word spread through the village that Greg was attempting to carve a replacement statue, reactions were mixed and complex. Some villagers saw it as an appropriate form of restitution, making amends through the same skill and dedication that had created the original. Others viewed it as presumptuous, an outsider's attempt to replace something irreplaceable through effort. Alone, Carmen, who had gradually warmed to Greg during his weeks of respectful behavior, expressed cautious optimism. If he is truly learning to understand what he damaged, she told Father Miguel during one of their regular conversations, then perhaps the work itself will teach him what words could not. But Maria Santos, whose family's memorial, Greg had unknowingly desecrated, remained skeptical. Actions have consequences, she told others in the village. Good intentions do not erase bad choices. Let him carve his statue, but do not expect it to restore what was lost. Father Miguel watched Greg's transformation with the careful attention of someone accustomed to observing spiritual development in its many forms. The young man who had arrived in San Miguel as a sentenced vandal was gradually being replaced by someone more serious, more thoughtful, more aware of the weight that actions carry in the world. "He is learning humility," the priest observed to Isabella during one of her weekly check-ins. "Not the performance of humility, but the genuine article. It is painful to watch and beautiful to see." As the feast day of San Miguel approached, the annual celebration when the entire village came together to honor their patron saint and remember their shared history, the question of Greg's statue became increasingly pressing. Eduardo estimated that the carving would be finished just days before the celebration, leaving little time for the community to decide whether they would accept it as part of their observances. The statue was taking shape with agonizing slowness. What had been a rough block of limestone gradually revealed the familiar silhouette of the Virgin Mary, her hands clasped in prayer, her face turned downward in an expression of compassionate sorrow. But Greg's inexperience showed in every detail, the proportions slightly awkward, the surface textures uneven, the facial features more earnest than elegant. "It is not perfect," Eduardo observed as they worked late one evening by lamplight, adding final details to the statue's robes. But perfection was not the goal. Your grandfather's statue was not perfect either. What matters is the intention behind the work, the respect given to the process. Greg stepped back to evaluate their progress, his hands aching from the day's intensive carving. The statue bore obvious signs of amateur craftsmanship, tool marks that a master would have smoothed away, proportions that an experienced sculptor would have refined, details that revealed his limited skill with the medium. But it also bore something else, evidence of genuine effort, of respect for the tradition he was attempting to join, of understanding earned through physical labor and spiritual contemplation. Every imperfect detail represented hours of careful work, mistakes corrected and lessons learned through direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "Will it be good enough?" Greg asked, studying the statue's face in the flickering lamplight. Eduardo considered the question seriously. Good enough for what? To replace what was lost? No, nothing can do that. To demonstrate that you understand what you destroyed. Perhaps, to begin repairing the trust you damaged. We will learn when the village sees what you have made. As they cleaned their tools and prepared to lock up the workshop for the night, Greg realized that his relationship with his own expectations had fundamentally changed during the intensive carving process. 3 months earlier, good enough would have been measured by audience reaction, engagement metrics, and viral potential. Now it was measured by the respect he had shown to materials, tradition, and the memory of people he had never met, but whose sacrifice had shaped the community that reluctantly hosted him. Tomorrow would bring more carving, more learning, more preparation for the moment when the village would judge whether his efforts represented genuine transformation or merely skillful performance. But tonight, as he climbed the stairs to his small room above the chapel, Greg felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of work done for its own sake, without cameras to record it or audiences to validate it. His mother's rosary lay on the nightstand where he placed it every evening, its wooden beads worn smooth by decades of faithful prayers. As he prepared for sleep, Greg found himself hoping that somehow, through the mysterious connections that bind the living to the dead, she might know that her wayward son was finally learning to create rather than destroy. The final weeks of carving passed in a blur of concentrated effort and growing anticipation. Greg's world had narrowed to the workshop's stone-dusty interior, the weight of tools in his hands, and the gradual emergence of recognizable features from the limestone block. His social media presence had dwindled to almost nothing, sporadic posts that generated little engagement from an audience that had moved on to newer, more consistently entertaining creators. But the digital silence that would once have panicked him now felt like freedom. Each day brought measurable progress on the statue, visible improvements in his technique, and deepening understanding of the craft that had been Eduardo's family legacy for generations. The work had become its own reward, requiring no external validation to justify the effort. 3 days before the feast of San Miguel, Greg and Eduardo put the finishing touches on their collaboration. The statue stood complete in Eduardo's workshop, a humble but sincere interpretation of the Virgin Mary that bore obvious signs of amateur craftsmanship alongside evidence of genuine devotion. Greg had insisted on carving his initials and the date into the base, but had also included Eduardo's name and a dedication. In memory of the sons of San Miguel, and in gratitude for the patience of their descendants. "It is finished," Eduardo said simply, stepping back to evaluate their months of work. "Not perfect, but finished. Now we must trust the village to judge what we have made." That afternoon brought an unexpected crisis that threatened to overshadow everything Greg had accomplished during his time in San Miguel. A rental car pulled up outside the chapel, disgorging Greg's manager, a small film crew, and a reporter from an online entertainment publication. They had come to document what his manager called the comeback story of the year, the fallen influencer's redemption journey in a picturesque Spanish village. "This is perfect," his manager explained, directing the cameraman to capture shots of Greg in his work clothes outside the chapel. The whole authentic redemption narrative, the traditional crafts angle, the spiritual awakening component. "We can turn this into a documentary, maybe a book deal, definitely a comeback tour with speaking engagements. You've been playing this perfectly." Greg watched the crew setting up their equipment in the plaza, positioning lights and adjusting camera angles to capture the most photogenic views of the village. Several villagers had emerged from their shops and homes to stare at the sudden invasion of professional media equipment, their faces reflecting the same wary suspicion they had shown toward Greg himself during his first days in San Miguel. "I don't want to make content about this," Greg said quietly. His manager looked at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. "What do you mean you don't want to make content? This is the biggest story of your career. The metrics alone on a redemption narrative like this." "I said no." Greg's voice was firmer now, carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "This isn't content. This is my life. These people aren't characters in my story. They're real people who trusted me enough to let me stay here and learn from them." The argument that followed drew attention from across the plaza. Greg's manager argued about contractual obligations and career suicide, while the film crew continued setting up shots, and the reporter began interviewing villagers about their experiences with the infamous American vandal. Each interview, each camera angle, each attempt to turn his transformation into entertainment felt like a new form of vandalism. Father Miguel emerged from the chapel during the height of the argument, his presence immediately calming the confrontation. He approached Greg's manager with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "I must ask you to respect our wishes," the priest said in careful English. "This is a place of worship and a home to people who value privacy. If you wish to create films, there are many other locations that would welcome your cameras." "With respect, Father," the manager replied. "Greg is under contract with our production company. This documentary represents significant financial investment. Greg is under no obligation to participate in projects that conflict with his spiritual development," Father Miguel interrupted gently but firmly. "His time here has been about learning to value things that cannot be measured or monetized. I would hate to see that progress reversed." As the afternoon progressed, Greg found himself caught between two worlds, the digital entertainment industry that had defined his adult life, and the community of faith and tradition that had slowly welcomed him despite his crimes against them. The choice felt binary and irreversible: return to his former life of manufactured controversy and audience-driven validation, or commit fully to a path he was still learning to understand. Eduardo appeared beside him as he wrestled with the decision, the old stone carver's presence as steady and reassuring as the limestone they had shaped together. "The statue is ready for the feast day," Eduardo said quietly, "but statues do not unveil themselves. They require someone brave enough to show their work to the community and accept whatever judgment comes." Greg looked across the plaza toward Eduardo's workshop, where their months of collaboration waited beneath protective cloth. Tomorrow, the village would decide whether his efforts represented genuine transformation or merely skillful performance. But today, he had to choose between the person he had been and the person he was still becoming. Greg's decision came with surprising clarity. He walked over to his manager and the film crew, who were still arguing with Father Miguel about access and filming rights. "Pack up your equipment," he said quietly. "I'm not doing the documentary. I'm not doing interviews. I'm staying here." The arguments that followed were heated and brief. His manager threatened legal action, breach of contract suits, and career destruction. The reporter pressed for at least a brief statement about his transformation journey. The film crew continued shooting despite his objections, treating his refusal as part of the narrative they were constructing around him. But Greg had learned something during his months in San Miguel that his former life had never taught him. Some things were more important than managing his image or maintaining his relevance. As the media circus finally packed up and left the village, taking their cameras and their predetermined narrative with them, Greg felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. The feast day of San Miguel dawned, clear and warm, with golden light streaming across the plaza as villagers prepared for their annual celebration. The morning began with special mass at the chapel, followed by traditional foods, music, and the ceremonial blessing of the harvest. It was a celebration that had continued for centuries, adapting to changing times while maintaining its essential character as a moment of community gratitude and remembrance. Greg spent the morning helping with preparations, setting up tables, arranging decorations, assisting elderly villagers who needed support getting to and from the festivities. The work was familiar now, an extension of the daily service routine he had maintained throughout his months of restitution, but today carried additional weight because of the decision the community would make about his carved offering. The statue remained covered in Eduardo's workshop, waiting for the afternoon ceremony when new artistic contributions to the village would be unveiled and either accepted or politely declined. Greg had no illusions about the quality of his work compared to Eduardo's decades of mastery, but he hoped the sincerity of his effort would be recognizable even in his amateur execution. As the afternoon ceremony approached, villagers gathered in the plaza around the damaged original statue. Father Miguel offered prayers for the dead soldiers the memorial honored, while Maria Santos placed fresh flowers at its base despite the red paint scars that still marked the stone. The contrast between the reverent ceremony and Greg's casual vandalism months earlier could not have been more stark. Today, Father Miguel announced to the assembled crowd, "We have the opportunity to consider a new addition to our village's artistic heritage. Eduardo Morales and his apprentice have prepared an offering for our evaluation." The crowd parted as Eduardo and Greg wheeled the covered statue from the workshop to the plaza. Greg's heart hammered as they positioned it near the original memorial, his months of work about to face judgment from the community he had harmed. The cloth covering seemed impossibly thin protection against the scrutiny he was about to endure. Eduardo stepped forward to address the villagers, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose family had served the community for generations. "My Grandfather carved our beloved Virgin Mary statue to watch over the graves of our war dead and comfort the families who mourned them, he said. When that memorial was damaged, we faced a choice: allow the harm to define our response, or use it as an opportunity for education and growth. He gestured toward Greg, who stood beside the covered statue with his hands clasped nervously in front of him. This young man came to us as a vandal and criminal, but he has spent these months learning not just to repair buildings and maintain our chapel, but to understand the value of what he damaged. The work you are about to see is not the product of a master craftsman, but of a student who has learned to respect the traditions he once mocked. Eduardo pulled away the cloth covering, revealing the limestone Virgin Mary that had consumed Greg's days and nights for months. The statue was clearly the work of an amateur, proportions slightly awkward, surface textures uneven, details more earnest than elegant, but it was also clearly the work of someone who had poured genuine effort and developing skill into every imperfect line. The villagers studied the statue in silence, their faces reflecting various degrees of surprise, evaluation, and consideration. Greg forced himself to breathe steadily as he waited for their response, knowing that their judgment would determine not just the fate of his carving, but the direction of his future. Maria Santos approached the statue slowly, her weathered hands reaching out to touch the stone surface as she had done with the damaged original months earlier. But this time, her touch was exploratory rather than mournful, feeling for the intentions embedded in the limestone through months of patient work. "It is not beautiful in the way my grandfather's statue was beautiful," she said finally, her voice carrying across the quiet plaza. "But it is honest. It shows us what can grow from genuine remorse when combined with patient effort." Other villagers began to move closer, examining details and discussing the work in quiet Spanish conversations. Greg caught fragments of their comments, observations about technique, questions about his motivations, debates about whether forgiveness should be extended to someone who had demonstrated change through actions rather than just words. Carmen spoke next, her practical voice cutting through the murmured discussions. "The question is not whether this statue replaces what was lost. Nothing can do that. The question is whether this work represents real change in the person who made it, and whether our community benefits from acknowledging that change." The village's formal acceptance of Greg's statue came not through grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but through the quiet actions that characterized San Miguel de la Cruz. Over the following days, residents began placing small offerings at the base of his carved Virgin Mary: wildflowers, votive candles, whispered prayers. The statue found its home in a place of honor beside the chapel, not replacing Eduardo's grandfather's damaged memorial, but complementing it. More meaningful to Greg was the handwritten letter that appeared on his nightstand one morning, signed by dozens of village residents and translated into careful English by Isabella. The letter thanked him not for the statue itself, but for the transformation it represented, proof that genuine remorse could lead to genuine change, that outsiders could learn to understand and honor local traditions, and that even serious harm could become the foundation for deeper respect and connection. "Your presence among us began with destruction," the letter read, "but it has continued with creation. You have shown our children that mistakes, however serious, need not define a person's entire story. You have demonstrated that authentic learning requires humility, patience, and the willingness to serve something greater than oneself. For these lessons, both given and received, we are grateful." Judge Morales officially completed Greg's community service requirements at a brief hearing 2 weeks after the feast day, but her questions revealed more interest in his future plans than in his legal obligations. When Greg explained his desire to remain in San Miguel and continue learning traditional crafts, the judge smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "The law's goal is rehabilitation, not punishment," she said. Your case suggests that sometimes rehabilitation requires more than compliance with court orders. It requires a fundamental change in how someone understands their place in the world. Greg's family relationships began to heal through letters and video calls that focused on his work rather than his past mistakes. His father expressed surprise at his son's commitment to physical labor and traditional crafts, while his aunt shared memories of his mother's pride in creating beautiful things with her hands, needlework, garden plantings, and the rosary prayers that had shaped Greg's childhood evenings. The discovery of his mother's rosary had led to conversations with Father Miguel about faith, prayer, and the spiritual dimensions of craftsmanship. Greg still struggled with formal religious practice, but he found meaning in the meditative aspects of stone carving and the sense of connection to something larger than his individual concerns. Faith is not about certainty, Father Miguel explained during one of their evening conversations. It is about trust. Trust that your efforts to do good work and serve others have meaning beyond what you can measure or understand. Your statue may not be perfect, but it represents perfect sincerity. And that is enough. Eduardo formally invited Greg to continue as his apprentice, a relationship that would require years of study but offered the possibility of preserving traditional skills for future generations. The old stone carver had begun documenting techniques passed down through his family, creating instructional materials that could help other young people learn crafts their ancestors had practiced for centuries. "You understand now what my grandfather knew," Eduardo told Greg as they planned their next project, a memorial stone for a family in a neighboring village. Art serves the community, not the artist. When your work makes other people's lives more beautiful or meaningful, then you have succeeded regardless of whether anyone knows your name. Greg's relationship with social media and online fame underwent a complete transformation. His accounts remained active, but now featured content about traditional crafts, village life, and the slow, meditative process of learning skills that required patience and dedication. His audience was smaller, but more engaged, drawn to authentic documentation of craftsmanship rather than manufactured controversy. The irony wasn't lost on him that his most meaningful content came from work he did without cameras present. The daily maintenance of the chapel, the patient hours spent learning to read stone grain, the quiet conversations with villagers who had become friends rather than content subjects. His best videos now showed the process of creation rather than destruction, teaching viewers about techniques and traditions rather than mocking them. Isabella's final report to the court system praised Greg's transformation, but cautioned against viewing his case as a simple redemption narrative. Real change, she noted, required ongoing commitment rather than dramatic moments of insight. Greg's true test would come not in the crisis of public judgment, but in the daily choice to continue growing in humility and respect. The vandalized original statue remained in the plaza, its paint scars gradually fading but still visible, a reminder of harm done and lessons learned. Eduardo had determined that complete restoration was possible, but would require specialized treatments that might alter the statue's character. After community discussion, they decided to leave the damage partially visible, integrating it into the memorial's history rather than pretending it had never occurred. Scars can be part of beauty, Maria Santos observed during the community meeting where this decision was made. They show that something survived what tried to destroy it. Our statue is still our statue, still worthy of our prayers, still protecting the memory of our boys. The paint marks just show that it has lived through difficult times and remained standing. On a quiet evening, 6 months after his arrival in San Miguel de la Cruz, Greg sat in the plaza, holding his mother's rosary, watching children play around the fountain while their grandmothers chatted on nearby benches. The scene was peaceful and timeless, unmarked by the crisis that had brought him to this place, except for the presence of two Virgin Mary statues, one scarred by his former arrogance, one shaped by his developing humility. He thought about the person he had been when he first saw this village, someone who viewed every interaction as potential content, every tradition as potential mockery, every sacred space as a backdrop for his performance of irreverence. That person felt like a stranger now, someone he could remember but no longer understand. The chapel bells rang the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the plaza as they had for centuries, calling people to prayer or simply marking the passage of time. Greg fingered the wooden beads of his mother's rosary, not yet ready for formal prayer, but grateful for the connection to something larger than his individual story. Tomorrow would bring more work, more learning, more opportunities to serve the community that had taught him the difference between creating and destroying. In the distance, Eduardo's workshop light glowed warmly, the old stone carver probably, working late on another project that would outlast them all. Greg smiled, knowing he would join him there in the morning, ready to continue learning the ancient craft of creating beauty from raw stone. His phone buzzed with a notification, but for the first time in years, Greg ignored it completely. The digital world would always be there, demanding attention and offering fleeting validation. But this moment, sitting in a plaza where his worst impulses had been transformed into his best efforts, surrounded by people who had taught him that some things were worth preserving rather than exploiting. This moment deserved his complete presence. The rosary beads were smooth and warm in his hands, worn by decades of his mother's faithful prayers. He still didn't know all the proper words or understand all the theological complexities, but he had begun to grasp what his mother had tried to teach him about reverence, about approaching sacred things with respect rather than irony. As the stars emerged above the plaza, and the last children were called home by their mothers, Greg stood to return to his small room above the chapel. Tomorrow would begin another day of patient work, another opportunity to choose creation over destruction, another chance to honor the trust the village had placed in him. The thank you letter from the community remained folded in his pocket, its words a constant reminder that redemption was not a destination, but a daily practice. His transformation from vandal to craftsman had been witnessed and acknowledged, but the real work lay ahead, the lifelong commitment to building rather than breaking, to serving rather than exploiting, to finding meaning in work done for its own sake rather than for external validation. Walking past both Virgin Mary statues in the quiet plaza, Greg felt the weight and privilege of being forgiven by people he had harmed, of being taught by masters he had initially dismissed, of being welcomed into a community he had once viewed as merely a backdrop for his entertainment. The scars on the original statue and the imperfections in his carved replacement told the same story, that human beings could learn, grow, and change, and that sometimes the most beautiful things emerged from the most unlikely beginnings.